In October 554 AD, on the banks of the muddy Volturno River in southern Italy, our silver-armored GoodKnight stood with 18,000 Byzantine warriors as they faced the final desperate gamble of a dying age. 20,000 Frankish and Alemannic raiders who had come south seeking plunder, but found instead the brilliant tactical genius of General Narses and a trap that would annihilate them almost to the last man. As the Gothic War entered its 19th year, and the last vestiges of Ostrogothic resistance crumbled into memory, this wasn't just another battle for territorial control. It was the moment when Emperor Justinian's grand vision of imperial restoration would be sealed in blood, when the ancient Roman dream of unity would triumph at a cost so devastating that Italy itself lay in ruins. Watch as our immortal knight witnesses one of history's most lopsided military victories, where a single gap in the Byzantine line becomes a killing field, where 20,000 warriors charge to their doom, and where the fate of the Italian peninsula is decided by arrows falling like rain upon unarmored backs. From Narsis's masterful deception that turned apparent weakness into overwhelming strength, to the final, terrible moments when Frankish chieftain Butellinus realized his ambition had led his entire army into annihilation, every moment of this epic tale shaped the destiny of medieval Europe. Subscribe to the GoodKnight Stories for more immersive historical journeys that transport you to history's greatest turning points, where our eternal knight in silver armor guides you through the rise and fall of empires with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which pivotal moment in history you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that fateful October day in 554 AD, when the last great army to challenge Byzantine rule in Italy marched to its destruction. A GoodKnight story, the Battle of Casilinum, 554 AD, Chapter 1. The wait of 19 years. The morning mist clung to the Volturno River like the ghosts of all the men who had died in Italy over the past 19 years. Our GoodKnight stood motionless in his silver armor, watching the water flow past the ancient stones of Casilinum, and felt the weight of nearly 2 decades of war settling into his bones like winter cold that never quite leaves. 19 years. He had been there when it began, when Emperor Justinian's grand dream of restoration first took shape in the minds of generals and the hearts of soldiers. He had marched with Belisarius through the early campaigns, had seen the first Gothic strongholds fall, had witnessed the hope that burned bright in Byzantine eyes when they believed this reconquest would be swift and glorious. But wars, the GoodKnight had learned, have their own terrible momentum. What begins as a campaign becomes a crusade. What starts as conquest becomes survival, and what promises glory delivers only exhaustion and the endless counting of the dead. The Gothic War had consumed Italy like a slow fire. Cities that had stood for centuries lay in rubble. Fields that had fed generations grew wild with weeds. The population had fled or died or simply disappeared into the chaos that follows when armies march back and forth across the same ground year after year, each side claiming to fight for the future while destroying the present. Our knight had seen it all. He had stood in the ruins of Rome when it changed hands for the 5th time. He had walked through villages where no children played because there were no children left. He had watched as the great Gothic kingdom of Theodoric once a beacon of stability in a chaotic world, crumbled piece by piece until only desperate men remained, calling on foreign allies for a salvation that would never come. Now, in this October of 534, the end was finally approaching. The Ostrogoths were finished as a fighting force. Their last king, Teia, had fallen at Mons Lactarius the year before, his death marking the end of Gothic royal authority in Italy. What remained were scattered holdouts, isolated garrisons, and the bitter knowledge that their kingdom was already a memory. But wars do not end cleanly. Even as the Gothic cause died, new players entered the game. The Franks, those ambitious Germanic cousins from the north, had sent their own armies south, not to save the Goths, that cause was lost, but to claim what they could from the wreckage. 30,000 Frankish and Alemannic warriors had crossed the Alps, led by chieftains named Lutherus and Butilinus, men who saw opportunity in Italy's devastation. The good knight adjusted his grip on his sword hilt and watched the Byzantine camp stirring to life around him. General Narses, the small, thin eunuch who had proven himself the most brilliant military mind of his generation, was already awake, moving between the tents with that peculiar energy that marked him as different from other commanders. Where Belisarius had been the perfect warrior hero, tall and handsome and beloved by his men, Narses was something else entirely. A calculating genius who saw battles as puzzles to be solved rather than contests to be won through courage alone. The good knight had served under both men, and he understood now why Justinian had chosen Narses for this final phase of the war. Belisarius inspired loyalty and fought with honor, but Narses won. He won completely, decisively, with a cold efficiency that left no room for enemy recovery. At Tagenai 2 years ago, he had shattered the main Gothic army. At Mons Lactarius, he had eliminated the last Gothic king. Now at Casilinum, he would face the final threat to Byzantine control of Italy. The enemy was different this time. These were not Goths fighting for their homeland, not desperate men defending their families and their way of life. These were Franks and Alemanni, raiders and opportunists who had come south for plunder and stayed for conquest. They fought differently, thought differently, and that difference would matter in the hours to come. Butilinus, the Alemannic chieftain who now commanded the combined force, was no mere raider. Intelligence reports suggested he harbored grander ambitions, perhaps to establish himself as a new Gothic king, perhaps to carve out his own kingdom from Italy's ruins. Such ambition made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. Ambitious men took risks that careful men avoided, and Narses was nothing if not careful. The good knight could see the enemy camp across the river, a sprawling collection of tents and wagons protected by earthworks and the natural barrier of the Volturno itself. 20,000 men, all infantry, all warriors bred in the Germanic tradition of close combat and personal valor. They had fortified a bridge crossing, built a wooden tower to guard their supply lines, and arranged their wagons in defensive formations that spoke of military experience and tactical awareness. But they were still infantry. All infantry. In an age when cavalry and horse archers could dominate a battlefield, when mobility and combined arms tactics were revolutionizing warfare, the Franks and Alemanni remained wedded to the old ways. They trusted in their axes and spears, in their courage and their numbers, in the simple mathematics of strong men charging forward to overwhelm their enemies through sheer force. It had worked for them before. It had worked for their ancestors. But it would not work against Narses. The Byzantine general had learned the lessons that the Gothic War had taught. He had seen how traditional Germanic tactics could be countered, how infantry formations could be broken, how even the bravest warriors could be defeated by superior strategy and coordination. His army was smaller than the enemy force, 18,000 men against 20,000, but it was balanced in a way that the Frankish army was not. Byzantine infantry held the center, disciplined soldiers who could fight in formation and hold their ground under pressure. On the wings, heavy cavalry waited for the moment to strike, their horses trained for battle, their riders experienced in the art of mounted combat. And scattered throughout the formation, the horse archers who had become the signature weapon of Byzantine warfare, mobile, deadly, capable of raining arrows on enemy formations while staying beyond the reach of spear and sword. The GoodKnight had fought alongside such forces before. He knew their strengths and their limitations, understood how each element of the army was designed to support the others. It was a complex system, requiring precise timing and careful coordination. But when it worked, when all the pieces moved together as Narses intended, it was devastatingly effective. But even the best plans could fail. Even the most brilliant generals could be undone by chance, by weather, by the simple chaos that followed when thousands of men tried to kill each other in a confined space. The GoodKnight had seen too many battles to believe in certain victory, had witnessed too many reversals of fortune to trust in any outcome until the last enemy lay dead or fled. Still, as he watched Narses moving through the camp, speaking quietly with his officers, checking on the readiness of his troops, the GoodKnight felt something he had not experienced in many years of this long war. Not confidence. That was too simple a word for what he felt. Rather, it was a sense that this battle would be different, that the careful preparations and tactical innovations of the past 2 years were about to be tested in a way that would determine not just the outcome of a single engagement, but the future of Italy itself. The sun was rising now, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the armies gathering on either side of the Volturno. Soon the GoodKnight knew the killing would begin. Men would die in numbers that would shock even veterans of this long war. Blood would soak into Italian soil that had already drunk too deeply of such offerings. But perhaps, this would be the last time. Perhaps the battle that was coming would finally bring the peace that Italy had not known for 19 years. Perhaps the Gothic War would end not with a whimper of exhaustion, but with a decisive stroke that would settle the question of who would rule the peninsula once and for all. The GoodKnight touched the pommel of his sword and prepared himself for what was to come. In his silver armor, he had walked through the rise and fall of kingdoms, had witnessed the birth and death of empires, had seen the endless cycle of war and peace that marked the passage of human time. Today, he would witness another turning point, another moment when the fate of nations hung in the balance. He did not know yet that this battle would be remembered as one of the most lopsided victories in military history. He did not know that Narses was about to demonstrate a level of tactical brilliance that would be studied by generals for centuries to come. He did not know that by evening, 20,000 enemy warriors would be reduced to perhaps 5 survivors, their army not just defeated, but annihilated. All he knew was that the war was ending, one way or another, and that he would be there to see it through to its conclusion. Chapter 2. The Eunuch General. The tent of General Narses was not what one might expect of the supreme commander of the Byzantine forces in Italy. There were no golden ornaments, no elaborate tapestries, no displays of wealth or power that marked the quarters of other great generals. Instead, the space was functional, almost austere, dominated by maps and documents, supply ledgers and intelligence reports. It was the workspace of a man who understood that wars were won not by grand gestures, but by careful attention to detail. Our GoodKnight had been summoned before dawn, along with the other senior officers, to receive final instructions for the battle that everyone knew was coming. As he entered the tent, he observed Narses with the same careful attention he had learned to apply to all commanders under whom he served. The general was exactly as the chroniclers would later describe him. Small in stature, abnormally thin, with the pale complexion of a man who spent more time with scrolls than in the sun. But his eyes were sharp, alert, missing nothing, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with physical presence. "Gentlemen," Narses began, his voice quiet but clear, "today we end this war." The statement hung in the air like an oath. Around the tent, hardened veterans of 19 years of fighting exchanged glances. They had heard such promises before, had seen too many final battles that led only to more campaigns, more sieges, more years of grinding warfare. But something in Narses' tone suggested this time was different. The GoodKnight studied the map spread across the general's table. The Volturno River curved through the landscape like a silver snake, with the enemy camp clearly marked on the far bank. Defensive positions were noted in red ink, supply lines in blue, potential routes of advance and retreat marked with careful precision. It was the work of a mind that left nothing to chance. "The enemy believes they hold the advantage," Narses continued, pointing to the Frankish positions. 20,000 men against our 18,000. A fortified camp with the river protecting one flank. A bridge under their control, allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. From their perspective, they have chosen their ground well. He paused, allowing his officers to absorb the tactical situation. The GoodKnight could see the problem immediately. The Franks had positioned themselves in a way that would force the Byzantines to attack across the river, to assault prepared positions held by numerically superior forces. It was exactly the kind of battle that favored infantry-heavy armies, exactly the kind of engagement that Germanic warriors had been winning for centuries. "But they have made one critical error," Narses said, his thin finger tracing a line on the map. "They assume we will fight their kind of battle. They expect us to charge their positions, to meet their infantry with our infantry, to turn this into a contest of strength against strength." The general looked up from the map, his gaze moving from officer to officer, ensuring that each man understood what he was about to say. "We will not give them that battle. Instead, we will give them something they have never faced before, something their tactics cannot counter, their experience cannot prepare them for." The GoodKnight felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the mixture of anticipation and dread that came before every major engagement. He had served under many commanders, had heard countless pre-battle speeches, but there was something different about Narses' approach. Where other generals spoke of honor and glory, of duty and courage, Narses spoke of mechanics, of cause and effect, of the cold mathematics of warfare. "Our deployment will be as follows," the general continued, moving small wooden pieces across the map to illustrate his intentions. "Infantry in the center, as expected. Archers integrated into the line to provide supporting fire. Cavalry on both wings, positioned to appear defensive, but ready to execute flanking maneuvers on my signal. It was a standard formation, one that the Byzantines had used successfully in previous engagements. But the GoodKnight sensed there was more to the plan than this conventional arrangement suggested. The key to victory, Narcissus said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, lies not in what we do, but in what the enemy believes we are doing. They must see weakness where we are strong, opportunity where we have prepared a trap. He gestured to one of his subordinates, a Heruli captain named Sindual, whose mercenary troops had served with distinction throughout the campaign. The man stepped forward, his scarred face impassive, waiting for orders. "Your men will be positioned in the center of our line," Narcissus told him. "But I want you to understand that your role today may require flexibility." The Heruli captain nodded, though the GoodKnight could see confusion in his eyes. Narcissus was being deliberately vague, speaking in the kind of coded language that suggested plans within plans, strategies that could not be fully revealed even to trusted subordinates. "Remember," the general continued, addressing the entire group, "the Franks fight as their ancestors fought. They form deep columns. They charge forward. They seek to break enemy lines through sheer force and momentum. This has served them well against opponents who fight in the same manner. But we are not such opponents." The GoodKnight thought of the Frankish warriors he had observed across the river. They were impressive men, tall and strong, armed with the traditional weapons of their people, long spears, heavy axes, broad swords. They fought with minimal armor, trusting in their speed and aggression to carry them through enemy lines before their opponents could respond effectively. It was a tactic that required courage, skill, and perfect timing. It was also a tactic that left them vulnerable to exactly the kind of combined arms warfare that Narcissus had perfected. "Our horse archers will be the key," the general explained, moving more pieces on the map. "Mobile, deadly, capable of striking from multiple directions while remaining beyond the reach of enemy weapons. The Franks have no effective counter to such tactics. Their infantry cannot catch our cavalry. Their formations cannot adapt quickly enough to respond to attacks from multiple angles." The plan was beginning to take shape in the GoodKnight's mind. It was elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its potential effectiveness. The Byzantines would use their tactical flexibility to negate the Frankish numerical advantage, would turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses through superior coordination and timing. But plans, even brilliant ones, could fail. The GoodKnight had seen too many battles where perfect strategies crumbled in the face of unexpected developments, where the chaos of combat rendered careful preparations meaningless. Weather could change, troops could panic, commanders could be killed at crucial moments. 1,000 variables could turn victory into defeat in the space of a heartbeat. "Sir," one of the officers ventured, "what if the enemy refuses to attack? What if they remain in their fortified positions and force us to come to them?" Narcissus smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth but considerable satisfaction. "They will attack," he said with absolute certainty. "Butulinus is not a man who can resist the appearance of opportunity. When he sees what he believes to be weakness in our lines, when he thinks he has found the key to victory, he will not hesitate to exploit it. His ambition will compel him to act, and his action will destroy him." The GoodKnight wondered what the general knew that he was not sharing. What intelligence or insight gave him such confidence in the enemy's behavior? But he had learned not to question Narcissus's judgment. The man had proven himself too many times, had demonstrated an understanding of warfare that went beyond conventional military wisdom. "Gentlemen," Narses concluded, "we have spent 19 years fighting for control of Italy. We have seen cities burned, populations scattered, entire regions reduced to wasteland. Today we have the opportunity to end that suffering, to bring peace to a land that has known nothing but war for nearly 2 decades. He paused, his gaze moving once again from face to face, ensuring that his words reached every man in the tent. But peace comes at a price. Victory requires sacrifice. Some of us may not see the sunset. Some of us may fall before the enemy is defeated. That is the nature of war, the cost of the choices we have made." The good knight felt the weight of those words, the acknowledgement of mortality that every soldier carried but rarely spoke aloud. In his silver armor, he had survived countless battles, had walked away from engagements that claimed the lives of thousands. But survival was never guaranteed, victory never certain. Each battle was a roll of dice with death, each engagement a test of skill, luck, and the favor of whatever gods watched over warriors. "However," Narses continued, his voice growing stronger, "I believe that today we will achieve something remarkable. Not just victory, but decisive victory. Not just the defeat of our enemies, but their complete destruction. When this battle is over, there will be no Frankish army left to threaten Italy, no Germanic force capable of challenging our control of the peninsula." The general began rolling up his maps, signaling that the briefing was coming to an end. But before dismissing his officers, he had one final instruction. "Remember that we fight not just for Emperor Justinian, not just for the glory of the Byzantine Empire, but for the future of Italy itself. The people of this land have suffered enough. They deserve peace, stability, the chance to rebuild what war has destroyed. Today, we give them that chance." As the officers filed out of the tent, the good knight lingered for a moment, studying the man who would command the battle to come. Narses was already turning his attention to other matters, reviewing supply reports, checking on the status of various units, attending to the 1,000 details that occupied a general's time before a major engagement. There was something almost inhuman about his focus, his ability to compartmentalize emotion and concentrate entirely on the practical requirements of command. Other generals inspired through charisma, through shared danger, through the bonds of brotherhood that developed between warriors who faced death together. Narses inspired through competence, through the quiet confidence that came from superior preparation and tactical brilliance. The good knight had served under both types of commanders. He understood the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, knew that different situations called for different kinds of leadership. Today, facing an enemy that outnumbered them and held strong defensive positions, competence would matter more than charisma, preparation more than inspiration. As he left the tent and walked back toward his own position in the Byzantine line, the good knight reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this moment. 19 years ago, when the Gothic War began, he could never have imagined that it would end with a eunuch general facing Germanic raiders on the banks of an Italian river. The war had taken so many unexpected turns, had produced so many unlikely heroes and villains, that its conclusion seemed almost anticlimactic. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps after 19 years of grand gestures and dramatic reversals, the war deserved to end with quiet efficiency rather than theatrical heroics. Perhaps Narses, with his maps and his calculations and his cold understanding of human nature was exactly the kind of commander needed to bring this long nightmare to its conclusion. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the armies preparing for battle. Across the river, the Frankish camp was stirring to life, warriors emerging from their tents, checking their weapons, preparing for what they believed would be another day of profitable warfare. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and leather, of horses and steel, of the 1,000 small preparations that preceded battle. Our GoodKnight moved through the Byzantine camp with practiced efficiency, checking his equipment one final time, ensuring that every strap was secure, every buckle tight, every piece of his silver armor properly positioned for the fighting to come. Around him, 18,000 men made their own preparations. Veterans of the Gothic War moved with the calm deliberation of soldiers who had done this many times before, while newer recruits betrayed their nervousness through hurried movements and constant adjustments to gear that was already perfectly arranged. The GoodKnight had seen it all before, the rituals that men performed when they knew that death might be waiting just hours away. But something was different this morning. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the normal pre-battle anxiety, a sense that events were moving toward a conclusion that would be remembered long after the participants were dust. The Gothic War was ending. Everyone could feel it. And this battle would determine not just who controlled Italy, but what kind of peace would follow nearly 2 decades of devastation. The Byzantine line was forming according to Nasser's careful plan. Infantry in the center, their shields locked together in the traditional formation that had served the empire well for centuries. Archers integrated into the line, their quivers full, their bowstrings checked and rechecked. On the wings, the cavalry waited with the patient stillness of predators, their horses sensing the tension of their riders, ears pricked forward toward the enemy positions across the river. The GoodKnight took his position with the central infantry, his silver armor gleaming in the morning sun. From here, he could see the entire battlefield spread out before him like a vast amphitheater. The Volturno River curved through the landscape, its waters running brown with autumn rains. On the far bank, the Frankish camp sprawled across several acres, protected by earthworks and the natural barrier of the water itself. 20,000 enemy warriors were preparing for battle, their movements visible even at this distance. The GoodKnight could make out individual figures moving between the tents, could see the glint of weapons being readied, could hear the distant sound of voices raised in what might have been prayers or war songs. They were impressive men, these Franks and Alemanni, tall and strong and confident in their abilities. They had come south seeking plunder and found instead the opportunity for conquest. Now they would discover what it meant to face the finest military machine of their age. But as the GoodKnight watched the enemy preparations, his attention was drawn to a disturbance in his own lines. Somewhere to his left, voices were raised in anger, and he could see men pushing and shoving, the careful order of the formation beginning to break down. The source of the commotion became clear as he moved closer. A Heruli mercenary captain named Sinduel was arguing with one of his subordinates, their voices carrying clearly across the morning air. The Heruli were Germanic mercenaries who had served the Byzantine Empire with distinction throughout the Gothic War. Fierce warriors whose loyalty was bought with gold, but whose courage was genuine. They were valuable allies, but they were also proud men who did not easily accept insults or perceived slights. You killed him for nothing! Sindual was shouting, his hand on his sword hilt. A servant, a man who could not even defend himself. The other Heruli, a younger man with the scars of many battles marking his face, stood his ground defiantly. He was stealing from my pack. I caught him red-handed, going through my belongings like a common thief. So you cut him down like a dog, without trial, without witnesses, without even asking what he was doing? I saw what he was doing. That was enough. The GoodKnight could see how this would end even before the final words were spoken. The Heruli had their own code of honor, their own sense of justice, and the killing of a defenseless servant, even a thieving one, violated their understanding of proper conduct. Sindual's anger was not just personal, but cultural, a response to behavior that his people considered dishonorable. You have shamed us all, Sindual declared, his voice carrying across the entire section of the line. You have acted without honor, without thought for the consequences of your actions. I will not stand beside a man who kills servants and calls it justice. The younger Heruli's face flushed with anger. Then perhaps you should find other men to stand beside, old man. Perhaps you should take your honor and your high principles and march away from this battle. Leave the fighting to those who understand what war really means. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Sindual's hand moved to his sword, and for a moment the GoodKnight thought blood would be spilled before the battle even began. But instead of drawing his weapon, the Heruli captain did something far more damaging to Byzantine prospects. "Very well," he said, his voice cold with fury. "If that is how you feel, if that is how all of you feel, then we will leave you to your war. The Heruli will not fight beside men who have no honor." The GoodKnight watched in growing alarm as Sindual turned away from the argument and began calling to his men. The Heruli mercenaries, perhaps 300 strong, were positioned in a crucial section of the Byzantine center. Their withdrawal would leave a significant gap in the line, a weakness that the enemy could exploit if they recognized it quickly enough. But Sindual was not finished. His anger had been building throughout the long campaign, fed by a dozen small slights and cultural misunderstandings, and the incident with the servant was merely the final provocation. As his men began to gather around him, he raised his voice so that it could be heard throughout the Byzantine formation. "We came here to fight beside honorable men," he declared. "We came here to serve an empire that we believed understood the meaning of justice. But we find instead cowards who kill servants and call it courage, commanders who care more for victory than for honor." The words carried clearly across the battlefield, and the GoodKnight could see their effect on both armies. In the Byzantine ranks, men turned to stare at the Heruli, confusion and concern written on their faces. Across the river, Frankish warriors had noticed the commotion and were pointing toward the disturbance in the enemy line. "We will not be part of this," Sindual continued. "We will not lend our swords to men who have forgotten what it means to fight with honor. Let the Byzantines win their victory without us, if they can." And with that, he turned and began marching away from the battlefield, his 300 warriors following behind him. The GoodKnight watched them go with a mixture of admiration and dismay. He understood Sindual's position, respected the man's adherence to his principles, but he also understood the tactical implications of their departure. The center of the Byzantine line now had a gap where the Heruli had been positioned. It was not a large gap, 300 men out of 18,000, but it was visible, obvious, a clear sign of weakness that any competent enemy commander would notice immediately. Worse, the manner of their departure had been public, dramatic, impossible to conceal from the watching Franks. The GoodKnight looked toward Narce's position, expecting to see panic, frantic efforts to reorganize the line, desperate attempts to fill the gap before the enemy could exploit it. Instead, he saw something that surprised him. The general was watching the Heruli departure with what appeared to be calm satisfaction, as if this development was not a disaster, but an opportunity. Other officers were approaching Narses, clearly concerned about the implications of the mercenaries' withdrawal. The GoodKnight could see them gesturing toward the gap in the line, could imagine their urgent recommendations for how to address this unexpected crisis. But Narses seemed unperturbed, his attention focused not on his own forces, but on the enemy positions across the river. And indeed, the Frankish camp was showing signs of increased activity. Warriors were gathering in groups, pointing toward the Byzantine line, clearly discussing what they had witnessed. The GoodKnight could imagine their conversations, could picture Butelinus and his subordinates analyzing this unexpected development and considering how to exploit it. A gap in the enemy center, a visible sign of discord in the Byzantine ranks, an opportunity to strike at what appeared to be a moment of weakness and confusion. It was exactly the kind of opening that aggressive commanders dreamed of, exactly the sort of tactical advantage that could turn a difficult battle into a decisive victory. The Franks would be fools not to exploit it, and whatever else they might be, they were not fools. But as the GoodKnight continued to observe Narce's reaction to the crisis, he began to suspect that something else was happening here, something more complex than a simple case of mercenary indiscipline disrupting carefully laid plans. The general's calm response, his apparent lack of concern about the gap in his line, suggested that this development might not be as unexpected as it appeared. Had Narses anticipated this? Had he somehow planned for the Heruli withdrawal, perhaps even encouraged it through subtle manipulation of the circumstances that led to the fatal argument? The GoodKnight had learned to expect such complexity from the Byzantine commander, had seen him turn apparent disasters into tactical advantages through careful preparation and psychological insight. If that was the case, if the Heruli departure was part of some larger strategy, then the gap in the Byzantine line was not a weakness to be exploited, but a trap to be sprung. The Franks, seeing what they believed to be an opportunity, would commit their forces to an attack that Narses had anticipated and prepared for. But it was also possible that the GoodKnight was giving the general too much credit, that this was simply an unfortunate development that would have to be dealt with as best as possible. Mercenaries were notoriously unpredictable, their loyalty dependent on factors that went beyond simple military considerations. Cultural pride, personal honor, perceived slights. All of these could influence their behavior in ways that no commander could fully anticipate or control. Across the river, the Frankish activity was intensifying. The GoodKnight could see warriors forming up in their traditional deep columns, could hear the sound of horns calling men to their positions. Butelinus had made his decision, and that decision was to attack. The battle was about to begin, and the Byzantine center had a gap where 300 Heruli warriors should have been standing. Whether that gap was a weakness or a trap would be determined in the next few hours, when 20,000 Frankish and Alemannic warriors tested their strength against Narses' tactical brilliance. The GoodKnight checked his weapons one final time and prepared himself for what was to come. In his long experience of warfare, he had learned that battles rarely unfolded according to plan, that the most careful preparations could be undone by chance, confusion, or simple human error. But he had also learned that great commanders found ways to turn unexpected developments to their advantage, to transform apparent disasters into opportunities for victory. Today he would discover which kind of commander Narses truly was. The sound of Frankish war horns echoed across the Volturno River, and the final phase of the Gothic War began. The war horns of the Franks carried across the Volturno River, like the voices of ancient gods calling their children to battle. Our good knight felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with the sound. Not fear, exactly, but the body's instinctive response to the promise of violence, the knowledge that in moments men would be trying to kill him, and he would be trying to kill them in return. Across the water, 20,000 warriors were forming into the deep column that was the signature of Frankish warfare. The good knight had seen such formations before, had faced them in smaller engagements throughout the long years of the Gothic War, and he understood both their strengths and their limitations. When properly executed, a Frankish wedge could punch through enemy lines like a spear through cloth, the concentrated mass of warriors at the front, breaking through defensive formations and creating chaos that the following ranks could exploit. But the tactic required perfect timing, absolute commitment, and an enemy willing to meet them head-on in the kind of direct confrontation that Germanic warriors preferred. Against opponents who fought differently, who used mobility and combined arms tactics, the wedge could become a liability, a concentrated target for archers, a formation too rigid to respond to flanking maneuvers. Butelinus, the Alemannic chieftain who commanded the combined force, was no fool. The good knight could see him moving among his warriors, his voice carrying across the water as he prepared them for the assault. He was a tall man, impressive in the way that Germanic leaders were expected to be, his presence commanding attention even at this distance. But intelligence was not the same as wisdom, and ambition was not the same as judgment. The chieftain had seen the gap in the Byzantine center where the Heruli had been positioned. He had witnessed the public departure of Sinduil and his 300 warriors, had observed the apparent confusion in the enemy ranks. To a man trained in traditional warfare, it must have seemed like a gift from the gods, an opportunity to strike at the heart of the Byzantine formation while it was weakened and disorganized. But the good knight was beginning to understand that nothing about this battle was as simple as it appeared. Narses remained calm, almost serene, as he watched the enemy preparations. The general staff officers had filled the gap left by the Heruli with other troops, but they had done so in a way that left the weakness still visible, still apparent to observers across the river. It was as if they wanted the Franks to see the opportunity, wanted them to believe that the Byzantine center was vulnerable. The sound of the enemy advance began as a low rumble, like distant thunder or the approach of a summer storm. 20,000 men moving in unison created a noise that could be felt as much as heard, a vibration that traveled through the ground and into the bones of those who waited to receive their charge. The good knight had experienced this sensation many times before, but it never became routine, never lost its power to remind him of the raw force that human beings could generate when they moved together with a single purpose. The Frankish wedge was a thing of terrible beauty as it approached the river. The warriors at the front were the largest and strongest, men chosen for their ability to break through enemy lines and create the initial breach that others would exploit. Behind them came rank after rank of fighters, each man pressed close to his neighbors, the entire formation moving with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. They were lightly armored by Byzantine standards, these Germanic warriors. Many fought bare-chested, their torsos painted with the symbols of their tribes, their only protection the leather trousers that marked them as free men rather than slaves. They carried the traditional weapons of their people, long spears for the initial impact, heavy axes for close combat, broad swords for the final moments when formations broke down and battle became a matter of individual skill and courage. It was an ancient way of fighting, one that had served their ancestors well in the forests of Germania and the plains of Gaul. But this was Italy in the 6th century, and their opponents were not tribal warriors or Roman legions of the old style. They were Byzantines, heirs to a military tradition that had evolved and adapted over centuries of warfare against every kind of enemy the world could produce. The Franks reached the river and began crossing at the bridge they had fortified, their wooden tower providing cover for the advance. The GoodKnight could see individual faces now, could make out the expressions of men who believed they were about to win a great victory. There was confidence in their movements, eagerness in their voices, the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that came from warriors who had never faced an opponent quite like Narses. But crossing a river under enemy observation was always dangerous, even with a fortified bridge. The Byzantines could have contested the crossing, could have turned the bridge into a killing ground where Frankish warriors would have been slaughtered as they tried to reach the far bank. Instead, Narses allowed them to cross unmolested, his archers holding their fire, his cavalry remaining motionless on the wings. To the Franks, this must have seemed like further evidence of Byzantine weakness or confusion. Their enemies were allowing them to deploy on favorable ground, were giving them the opportunity to form their battle line without interference. It was exactly what an aggressive commander would hope for, the chance to bring superior numbers to bear against a disorganized opponent. The GoodKnight watched the enemy formation take shape and marveled at its disciplined precision. Whatever else might be said about the Franks, they were experienced warriors who understood their craft. The wedge was perfectly formed, its point aimed directly at the gap in the Byzantine center where the Heruli had been positioned. Butulinus had chosen his target well, had identified what appeared to be the weakest point in the enemy line, and concentrated his entire force against it. It was exactly what Narses had expected him to do. The Byzantine general raised his hand, and across the line, officers prepared their men for the impact that was coming. The GoodKnight felt the familiar pre-battle calm descend upon him, the strange peace that came when all the preparation was finished and only the fighting remained. His sword was loose in its scabbard, his shield properly positioned, his armor checked one final time. Around him, 18,000 men made their own final preparations, each according to his own rituals and beliefs. The Frankish war cry began as the wedge started its final advance. It was a sound unlike anything else in human experience. 20,000 voices raised in unison, a roar of defiance and aggression that was meant to terrify enemies and inspire allies. The GoodKnight had heard such cries before, from Goths and Vandals, from Huns and Gepids, from all the various peoples who had challenged the empire over the centuries. It was always impressive, always stirring, but it was also always the same. The sound of men trying to convince themselves that courage alone could overcome superior tactics and preparation. The ground began to shake as the Frankish charge gained momentum. The wedge was moving at full speed now, the warriors at the front lowering their spears, the men behind them raising their axes and swords, the entire formation focused on the single point where they intended to break through the Byzantine line. It was a magnificent sight, the kind of display that chroniclers would remember and poets would celebrate, regardless of the outcome. But the GoodKnight was watching Narses, and what he saw there was not concern, but anticipation. The general's hand was still raised, his officers still waiting for the signal that would unleash the Byzantine response. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and the trap would be obvious. Too late, and the Frankish charge might actually succeed in breaking through the center. The enemy was 50 yards away now, close enough that individual faces could be distinguished, close enough that the GoodKnight could see the determination in their eyes, the absolute commitment that marked warriors who had staked everything on a single, decisive assault. They believed they were about to win, believed that their courage and strength would carry them through the Byzantine line and into the enemy rear, where they could roll up the flanks and turn an orderly battle into a rout. 30 yards. The Frankish spears were leveled now, aimed at the gap in the Byzantine center, ready to punch through the hastily reorganized line and create the breach that would decide the battle. The war cry had reached a crescendo, a sound that seemed to fill the entire world, drowning out everything except the thunder of 20,000 feet striking the ground in unison. 20 yards. The GoodKnight could smell the enemy now. Sweat and leather, iron and fear, the distinctive scent of men who had been living rough for months and were now betting their lives on a single moment of violence. He could see the whites of their eyes, could make out the individual weapons they carried, could almost feel the impact that was coming. 10 yards. The Frankish wedge was committed now, unable to stop or change direction, its momentum carrying it forward like a boulder rolling down a mountainside. The warriors at the front were already raising their weapons, preparing for the moment when they would crash into the Byzantine line and begin the work of killing that would determine who controlled Italy. And then Narses dropped his hand. The Byzantine response was not what the Franks expected. Instead of meeting the charge head-on, instead of trying to stop the wedge through sheer force, the troops in the center began to give way. Not in panic, not in rout, but in a controlled withdrawal that allowed the Frankish spearhead to penetrate into the gap that had been left by the Heruli departure. The enemy poured into the opening like water through a broken dam, their momentum carrying them deep into the Byzantine formation. For a moment, it seemed as if Butolinus had been right, as if the gap in the center was indeed a fatal weakness that could be exploited for decisive victory. But the GoodKnight was watching the wings, and what he saw there made him understand the true brilliance of Narses' plan. The Byzantine cavalry, which had remained motionless throughout the Frankish advance, was beginning to move. Not forward, not in a direct charge, but in a wheeling motion that would bring them around the flanks of the enemy formation. The trap was about to be sprung. The moment when the Frankish wedge penetrated the Byzantine center was like watching a sword pierce flesh, sudden, violent, seemingly decisive. Our GoodKnight felt the impact as 20,000 warriors crashed into the gap where the Heruli had been positioned, their momentum carrying them deep into what they believed was the heart of the enemy formation. The sound was indescribable, the clash of weapons against shields, the screams of wounded men, the splintering of spear shafts, and the ring of steel on steel. For perhaps 30 heartbeats, it seemed as if Butolinus had been right, as if his bold gamble would pay off in the kind of crushing victory that Germanic chieftains dreamed of. The Frankish spearhead was through the Byzantine line, their axes and swords beginning the terrible work of close combat, their war cries echoing across the battlefield as they pressed forward into what they thought was the enemy rear. But the good knight was watching Narses, and what he saw on the general's face was not alarm, but cold satisfaction. The Byzantine commander stood motionless on a small rise that gave him a clear view of the entire battlefield. His staff officers clustered around him, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, as if this were a training exercise rather than a battle that would determine the fate of Italy. The trap was about to be sprung. The first sign that something was wrong came from the Frankish warriors themselves. Those who had penetrated deepest into the Byzantine formation began to slow, their advance losing momentum as they realized that they were not breaking through to open ground, but pushing into an increasingly constricted space. The gap in the enemy center was not as wide as it had appeared from across the river, and the Byzantine troops on either side were not fleeing in panic, but maintaining their positions, creating a funnel that channeled the Frankish advance into an ever narrower killing ground. The good knight could see confusion beginning to spread through the enemy ranks. The warriors at the front of the wedge were still pushing forward, driven by their own momentum and the pressure of the men behind them. But those further back were starting to realize that something was amiss. The easy victory they had expected was not materializing, and the Byzantine response was not what their experience had taught them to expect. And then Narses raised his hand again, and the real battle began. The Byzantine cavalry, which had remained motionless on the wings throughout the Frankish advance, suddenly exploded into motion. But they did not charge forward in the traditional manner, did not seek to meet the enemy head-on in the kind of direct confrontation that Germanic warriors understood. Instead, they executed a complex wheeling maneuver that brought them around the flanks of the Frankish formation, moving with the precision of dancers and the deadly purpose of wolves. The good knight watched in fascination as the maneuver unfolded. The cavalry on the right wing swept wide around the enemy flank, their horses moving at a controlled gallop that would bring them to the rear of the Frankish formation at exactly the right moment. Simultaneously, the cavalry on the left wing executed a similar movement, the two forces coordinating their advance with the kind of precision that could only come from extensive training and perfect timing. But it was the horse archers who would deliver the killing blow. As the cavalry reached the rear of the Frankish formation, they did not charge home with lance and sword as traditional heavy cavalry would have done. Instead, they wheeled again, presenting their flanks to the enemy, while their mounted archers began to rain arrows down upon the unprotected backs of the Germanic warriors. The effect was devastating. The Franks and Alemanni, committed to their forward advance and packed tightly together in their traditional wedge formation, had no defense against this kind of attack. Their shields were facing forward, their attention focused on the Byzantine infantry to their front, their formations too dense to allow for quick maneuvering. The arrows fell among them like a deadly hail, finding gaps in armor, striking down men who had no way to strike back at their tormentors. The good knight had seen horse archers in action before, but never with such devastating effect. The Byzantine mounted bowmen were masters of their craft, capable of shooting accurately while moving at speed, able to maintain a constant barrage while staying beyond the reach of enemy weapons. They circled the Frankish formation like hunters around a trapped animal, their arrows creating chaos and death wherever they struck. But the true genius of Narsis's plan became apparent when the Heruli reappeared on the battlefield. Sinduil and his 300 warriors, who had marched away in apparent disgust at the beginning of the battle, suddenly emerged from a patch of woodland to the east of the main engagement. Their withdrawal had not been genuine after all, but part of an elaborate deception designed to lure the enemy into exactly the kind of trap that was now closing around them. The GoodKnight felt a moment of admiration for the complexity of the plan. Narses had anticipated not just the Frankish response to the apparent gap in his line, but had orchestrated the entire sequence of events that led to that gap appearing in the first place. The argument between the Heruli warriors, the dramatic departure of Sinduil's men, the visible weakness in the Byzantine center, all of it had been theater, a carefully staged performance designed to convince the enemy that they were seeing an opportunity when they were actually walking into a trap. The Franks were caught in a crossfire now, attacked from front, rear, and both flanks simultaneously. Their wedge formation, which had been their greatest strength during the advance, became their greatest weakness once they were surrounded. The men at the front could not retreat because of the pressure from those behind them, while those at the rear could not advance because of the arrows falling among them. The entire formation was locked in place, unable to maneuver, unable to respond effectively to attacks from multiple directions. Butelinus, the Alemannic chieftain who had led his men into this disaster, was somewhere in the middle of the formation, probably only now beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. The GoodKnight could imagine his thoughts, the growing realization that what had seemed like a tactical opportunity was actually a carefully prepared killing ground, that his ambition had led 20,000 warriors into a trap from which there might be no escape. The slaughter that followed was methodical, almost mechanical in its efficiency. The Byzantine horse archers continued their deadly work, their arrows finding targets with monotonous regularity, while the infantry pressed in from the sides, using their superior mobility to attack the flanks of the trapped formation. The Franks fought with desperate courage, their axes and swords taking a toll on any enemy who came within reach. But courage alone could not overcome the tactical disadvantage in which they found themselves. The GoodKnight moved forward with the Byzantine infantry, his silver armor gleaming in the afternoon sun as he pressed into the melee. Around him, the sounds of battle reached a crescendo. The clash of weapons, the screams of wounded men, the shouted orders of officers trying to maintain control in the chaos of close combat. But beneath it all was a different sound, one that he had heard before in battles where one side held an overwhelming advantage, the sound of systematic destruction, of an army being methodically annihilated. Individual acts of heroism stood out amid the carnage. A Frankish warrior, his body pierced by 3 arrows, continued to swing his axe until a Byzantine spear finally brought him down. An Alemannic chieftain, recognizing that the battle was lost, gathered a handful of his men around him and tried to cut a path through the encircling enemies, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he struck down opponent after opponent before finally falling beneath a rain of blows. But such moments of individual courage could not change the overall trajectory of the battle. The Frankish formation was disintegrating, its cohesion destroyed by the constant pressure from multiple directions. Men began to break and run, abandoning their weapons and their comrades in a desperate attempt to escape the killing field that the battlefield had become. The GoodKnight found himself face to face with a young Frankish warrior, a boy who could not have been more than 16 years old, but who fought with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The youth's spear thrust was clumsy, telegraphed, easily parried, but there was something in his eyes that gave the GoodKnight pause. Not fear, but a kind of resigned determination. The look of someone who knew he was going to die but was determined to sell his life dearly. For a moment, the two warriors circled each other in the midst of the larger battle, each looking for an opening, each aware that this personal combat might be their last. The boy was brave, the GoodKnight had to give him that. But bravery was not enough against experience and superior equipment. A feint to the left, a quick thrust to the right, and the young Frank was down, his blood soaking into the Italian soil that had already drunk so deeply of such offerings. The GoodKnight paused for a moment over the fallen youth, struck by the waste of it all. This boy had probably never seen Italy before this campaign, had probably joined the expedition for adventure or plunder, or simply because his chieftain had commanded it. Now he would die far from home, his body left to rot on a battlefield whose significance he probably never understood. But there was no time for such reflections. The battle was reaching its climax, and the final act of the drama was about to unfold. Somewhere in the chaos, Butulinus was making his last stand. The Alemannic chieftain who had dreamed of carving out a kingdom in Italy, now facing the reality of his ambition's cost. The GoodKnight could see the knot of warriors gathered around their leader, could hear the ring of steel on steel as they fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that surrender was not an option. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. A Byzantine spear found its mark, and Butulinus fell, his death cry lost in the general din of battle. With their leader gone, the last organized resistance collapsed, and what had been an army became a mob of terrified men, seeking only to escape the slaughter that surrounded them. But escape was not possible. The Byzantine cavalry had sealed off all routes of retreat, their horses forming an impenetrable barrier around the killing field. The Frankish and Alemannic warriors who had crossed the Volturno River that morning with such confidence were trapped, surrounded, doomed to die far from their homes in service to an ambition that had proven to be nothing more than a deadly illusion. The massacre continued until the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of blood and casting long shadows across a battlefield littered with the dead and dying. When it was finally over, when the last enemy warrior had fallen or fled, the silence that followed was almost as terrible as the noise that had preceded it. 20,000 men had crossed the river that morning. According to the chroniclers, only 5 would live to see another dawn. He was the perfect instrument of imperial will, brilliant enough to achieve victory, but unthreatening enough to survive success. As dawn broke over the battlefield, revealing the full scope of the previous day's carnage, messengers were already riding toward Constantinople with news of the victory. The emperor would be pleased, the court would celebrate, and the chroniclers would begin the process of turning military success into imperial propaganda. The Battle of Casilinum would be remembered as a triumph of Byzantine arms, a vindication of Justinian's reconquest policy, a demonstration of the empire's continued vitality and strength. But the GoodKnight, walking among the dead in the morning light, understood that victory and triumph were not the same thing. The empire had achieved its immediate objectives, had eliminated its enemies, and secured its territorial claims. But the cost of that achievement, in blood, in treasure, in the devastation of the very lands that had been reconquered, raised questions about whether the victory was worth the price that had been paid for it. Italy was Roman again, but it was a different Italy than the one that had been lost to the barbarians a century earlier. The population was smaller, the cities were ruined, the economy was shattered. It would take generations to rebuild what the war had destroyed, and there was no guarantee that the empire would have the resources or the will to undertake such a massive reconstruction effort. The good knight had witnessed the rise and fall of many kingdoms, had seen the endless cycle of conquest and collapse that marked the passage of human time. He understood that all victories were temporary, all empires mortal, all achievements subject to the erosion of time and the ambitions of new enemies. The Battle of Castellinum had ended one chapter in the story of Italy, but it had also begun another, and there was no way to know how that new chapter would unfold. As he prepared to leave the battlefield to continue his eternal journey through the corridors of history, the good knight took one last look at the scene of Narcissus' triumph. The dead had been cleared away, the pyres had burned down to ash, and the field was already beginning to return to its natural state. In a few years, grass would grow over the bloodstains, farmers would plough the soil where warriors had died, and the battle would exist only in the memories of those who had survived it and the accounts of those who would write about it. But the consequences would endure. The Gothic War was over, the Frankish threat eliminated, and the Byzantine Empire had achieved its goal of reconquering Italy. Whether that achievement would prove to be a lasting triumph or a Pyrrhic victory remained to be seen. History would be the judge, and history, the good knight had learned, was often a harsh and unforgiving tribunal. The silver-armored knight mounted his horse and rode away from Castellinum, leaving behind the scene of one of the most decisive battles in the long history of warfare. Behind him, the Volturno River continued its ancient flow toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of 20,000 men who had died far from home in service to ambitions that had proven to be nothing more than deadly illusions. The Gothic War was over. Italy belonged to the Empire once again. But the price of that victory would echo through the centuries, a reminder that even the most brilliant military success could carry within it the seeds of future tragedy. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.